To a casual observer, it might seem like self-kindness means eating healthy foods or spending quality time out in nature or, just taking good care of yourself. And all those things are great and important for overall well-being. But that won't be what we're talking about here, because none of those things leads directly to spiritual and emotional freedom. And we are all about the spiritual and emotional freedom. So I want to talk about a different, more fundamental sort of self-kindness here. The kind that ends the internal war between all parts of the ego self. Spiritual students ask me all the time about why I advocate being kind to the ego self. But even more than that, they want to know more specifically how how one goes about doing that. So that's the purpose of this video, and I'll do my best here to give a basic explanation or example of the how. But before we do that, let me back up and explain for anyone who isn't familiar with spiritual teachings about the ego, that there's a strong tendency for those of us on this type of spiritual path to want to do battle with our own egoic self, or to hold a grudge against the egoic self, because these teachings point out correctly that our own true nature is eternal and peaceful and free. Our own true nature is God, basically, the limitless divine self. And the teachings also state that our own egoic lens of perception kind of sits on top of that true self, and its primary function is to cover up or obscure the eternal, unchanging reality of your true divine identity. And so, given all of that, we as students of these teachings tend to engage in a grudge match with the ego self. But I can tell you from years of my own experience, that is not a good idea. It's an understandable response, but it's not a good idea for so many reasons. The main one being that it doesn't work. It's easy to feel like the ego is a separate being or a separate consciousness within the self, like an obnoxious roommate that we don't want to hang out with. I've used that analogy before. The self-sabotager, the self-critic, or that inner scaredy cat, the one who's so afraid of what other people think, or whoever it is. We have a million of them. And if they would only go away, we could have the whole place to ourselves, and then we'd be happy, right? It's easy to believe that because that's kind of how it feels inside. Me versus them, or me versus it, in an endless tug-of-war, with happiness as the end prize that maybe you'll be able to walk away with if and when you finally crush the competition. And yes, spiritual teachings do tell us accurately that there's an eternal peace that is the true reality of existence. And this self, this roommate house, ain't it. And that's true. True reality is glorious and unbelievably simple and magnificent in its wholeness, in its oneness. So that tends to give those of us who follow those teachings even more motivation to battle those inner roommates, so that we can somehow tear down the house and evict the bastards and, know the true peace of God instead. Again, understandable, but not really helpful. Not in my experience, anyway. Because let's talk about those roommates for a minute. For starters, you're one of them. The conscious thinking you, I mean. It might be that your name is on the lease, so to speak. It might be your house, but you're still just one of the occupants. And we kind of forget about that, even those of us who follow those spiritual teachings. We forget that we ourselves are part of the system that obscures truth. We go, I, the spiritual student, am deeply interested in eternal truth and in knowing divine peace and inner freedom. But those other separate intelligences inside me, they are totally crashing my God party and they are ruining everything. But that's not really how it is. The egoic lens of perception is constructed in such a way that it splits everything into seemingly separate parts. That function is actually necessary, by the way, in order for you to have an incarnated experience in a human body. So your egoic perception makes that possible for you to be able to see life from a separate vantage point with a distinct sense of your own individual identity and your own unique experiences and your own outlook on life. And you know what? Whether you think incarnation is a good thing or a bad thing, that kind of doesn't matter, because here you are, incarnated. So anyway, that egoic lens also is not limited to the way that we perceive our outer world. The inner world is made separate in similar ways, not in true ways any more than our perception of the world outside is perceived in true ways. But I can tell you that as my own mind started to become more and more healed, I started to see very clearly that all parts of the mind are the same ego, but functioning in compartmentalized ways. And I also saw that the distinction between inner and outer, the inner and outer world, also isn't what I have experienced it as in the past. The lines are way more blurry than that. You know, it starts to be experienced more and more as all one thing, all oneself. The immediate effects that the inner has on the outer start to become very noticeable and very interconnected when the mind starts to authentically heal. But until that point, they feel separate. Everything feels separate, especially the divine self, which feels totally separate, but isn't. It's here right now, underlying all those seemingly separate pieces. And believe it or not, the oneness of the divine and the seemingly separated pieces of the egoic self are all one thing too. In truth, I mean, everything is one in truth. Nothing could exist outside of that oneness. And a mind that heals starts to recognize the truth of all this firsthand. And again, this egoic perception of splitting off of the parts from each other is part of our functioning as a human being. It helps make our human experience possible, for better and for worse. So, setting aside the totality of oneness with the divine for a minute, let's just narrow the focus back down onto the ego self that we currently recognize ourselves to be. All parts of the egoic self are one egoic self operating in different ways with different functions. And when we're at odds with these inner portions of the self, well, the war never stops, inside and outside. And trust me, that war that we wage brings us no closer to waking up into our own oneness in God. And I don't know about you, but that's my one great desire, knowing my own oneness in God and helping anybody else who wants to do the same. But, you know, I'm also pragmatic. I start from where I actually am, from what my own current experience is. And I had to admit, after decades of trying, that I was getting nowhere in my tug-of-war battles. And it was really quite a painful way to live, to be engaged in that endless war. And I found that being kind to your own ego works. Self-kindness works in a very big way. So that's why I advocate kindness and compassion and infinite patience and humility. And yes, even deep respect when approaching any part of the egoic self within. Because you know what? You deserve it. All parts of you deserve it, even the inconvenient ones, maybe even especially the inconvenient ones. Because in their own way, they are the gatekeepers to your knowing of divine truth. Battle them and the gates stay locked because they are constantly having to defend themselves from what they see as your unfair and unwarranted attacks. So they'll keep those gates extra double locked, if only just to spite you. And yes, they have the power to do that at this stage of your spiritual development. Because here's the conundrum. It's only after you travel a fair old way through those open gates that you start to authentically know and experience for yourself that God is the only power and illusory creations don't in fact block anything. But you kind of only recognize that after the fact in your rear view mirror, you know? So basically, if your desire is to get past those gates, then war is not the answer. A different way is needed. So by making the commitment to consistently engage with these split off aspects of your own egoic self with kindness and compassion, you will find that a very different kind of passageway starts to open up before you. And yeah, it does take some time and sustained effort to teach yourself how to reach out and be unconditional in your kindness. It does. This is not an overnight kind of change. But comparatively, I think you'll find that the pace of healing and evolution picks up dramatically, and the road becomes way less bumpy. The whole process is quite miraculous, really. Or rather, it's miraculous when you diligently allow for miracles, meaning when you allow the divine, the bringer of miracles, to be completely in charge of the process. If you don't let the divine be in charge of the process, you're basically just doing self-help, which is great, but that's not what we're talking about here. So what does that look like? What's an example, or at least a general concept that gives an idea of what it looks like to be kind and to meet that inconvenient inner self with patience and respect, all the while doing it under divine supervision? Okay, I'll give you a little analogy, another one. Yes, I'm the queen of weird little analogies. But here's an imaginary scenario to give you a general idea of how it might go. Bear with me. So, okay. It's kind of like, think back to childhood for a minute and imagine that one of your troublesome ego aspects is sort of like that neighborhood kid who has never liked you. And every time he sees you, he always grabs your hand and goes, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself, you know, that kid. And you hate that, right? And you struggle and you go, ow, quit it. And they go, what? I'm not doing anything. You're the one who's hitting yourself. Right? Yeah. And that happens every time he comes around. So you, the conscious self, you're really fed up. Yeah. And your instinct is to fight back. Like I said, you want to hit or kick or maybe bite if you're a biter. Or maybe you want to get that kid in trouble, get him grounded, right? Suppress his ability to mess with you again. Totally understandable reactions. Self-defense, right? But fighting back or getting that kid grounded only makes him more determined to torment you the next time he sees you. So fighting really doesn't work. So when you're good and sick of this pattern playing itself out over and over and over and over, maybe you start to rethink. You reevaluate your half of it, your half of the pattern, because of course your half of the pattern is the only half that you can control. And you recognize that you've been locked together in this kind of weird automatic game with two equal players. And up until now, you always step up to play your part. But now you can see that it gets you nowhere. And you're truly, seriously done with it. So you drop your half. You drop your grudge. Even though, yeah, he's been hitting you for years. And even though it is so unfair. And even though you have so many good reasons for fighting him. You're so justified to fight back, you know? But you decide anyway to step out of this thing that you've been locked in, this never-ending partnership of attack and defense. And you do it for your own sake, really, at least at first. And instead, you get curious about that kid. Why is he so interested in picking on you? What's the motivation, you know? And you realize, now that you're thinking about it, you actually have no idea what makes that kid tick. Why does he do anything that he does? You've been so busy attacking and defending that you have no idea what he's all about, how he sees things, or what his own issues or troubles might be. So the next time you see that kid, you decide to invite him over to your uncle's house to have a popsicle with you, because your uncle is this super amazing guy and he has this fantastic house where you're allowed to go in the kitchen and just help yourself to popsicles from the freezer anytime you want. And those popsicles are incredibly super delicious. They're like legendary on the block. So the kid says yes. Even before the invitation is fully out of your mouth, he says yes. And this is always true in my experience, by the way. When your invitation is honest and authentic with no hidden agendas, they will always show up, these parts of the self, always. So the kid is here, and he most likely balks at going inside your uncle's kitchen because it might be a trap. And besides, he doesn't like how all that light is streaming out of the windows. And he really doesn't want to meet your uncle. Like, really doesn't want to meet him. But you know what? He'll wait on the porch while you get the popsicles. And so you hand him one, and maybe he says, "Are you trying to poison me with this? Because I know you hate me." And you need to be really honest, like really honest in your dealings with these aspects of the self, because they're you and they know when you're bullshitting. So you say, well, yes, it's true. I've spent an awfully long time hating you, but I realize now that I don't want to do that anymore. And I realize that I don't know anything about you, and I want to. And maybe he scoffs and rolls his eyes, you know, and refuses to tell you anything about himself. And so you just eat your popsicles together in silence on the porch while your uncle smiles out the kitchen window at both of you. And it might take you months of patiently meeting this kid, this part of the self, on your uncle's front porch before an authentic relationship starts to form, because trust takes time. And it has to come from you, the conscious part of the self. You have to be the one to step forward and extend your hand and keep it extended no matter what. You have to become trustworthy in the eyes of this kid. And you know, the kid might still test you now and then. He might do that same old thing, grab your wrist just to see how you'll respond, just to see if you're being real when you say that you want a different kind of relationship. So when that happens, and it probably won't happen nearly as often as before, but when it happens, you don't attack or defend like you used to. You turn toward the kid and you say, "Oh, hello, I see you there." And you just welcome that inconvenient aspect of the self with your whole heart, regardless of what his response might be to your heartfelt welcome. And you just sit together on your uncle's porch, your divine uncle. And over time, you'll find out what's been bothering that kid all along. He'll confide in you, and gradually a real relationship of mutual trust and respect forms. And eventually, you and all of your egoic parts more or less get on the same page as much as is possible. And they will genuinely try to help you with your goal of spending more time inside your uncle's house. They might not feel comfortable going in there themselves, but they won't actively stop you from having that experience. They'll unlock the gates. And then it'll be up to you to learn how to open them and move through them. That's your journey. So does this kind of inner self work all by itself solve all your troubles and make you happy forever? No. Nothing of this world will do that. It'll help you be happier. Of course it will. Being kind and compassionate with all parts of the self means that the pieces of your split off mind are no longer at war with each other. So cooperation and mutual respect does begin to happen. An authentic relationship starts to form. And that feels better than it was before. But it's the true healing of the mind that we're really after here. The healing of separation in our own perception, so that we can know our own true divine nature. You are your uncle's house, you know? You are that. And it's your birthright to know yourself as that. It's your birthright to know true peace and eternal happiness, the unshakable kind. And that's why any kind of inner child work or inner shadow work, in my opinion anyway, should never take place anywhere other than at your uncle's house. Not if you want true freedom or true peace or the knowing of your own true divine identity. Because it's always the uncle alone who does the true healing. And plus, there's popsicles.